Very warm welcome to today's LLF session, which brings Delhi and Lahore together. We're privileged to have Professor Kavita Singh with us. We've been talking to each other, courtesy Professor Salima Hashmi, for well over 3 years, and we finally managed to have you. So it's a sheer pleasure to have you with us tonight. Tonight's session is going to be focusing on the Mughal miniature paintings and how at that point, there were subjectivities, not from the standpoint of the patron, but more from the standpoint of the painter himself or herself. So what is fascinating is that while there was portraiture and official sanction of miniature, it's often viewed with the imprint of the state and statecraft. But the fact of the matter is that there are such interesting subtleties and nuances that Professor Singh will explore through the session. So we're keenly looking forward to looking into those dynamics. And Professor Hashmi will bring another counter perspective, which will be looking at modern contemporary miniatures in Pakistan and view those subjectivities from the standpoint of an array of artists, including matters such as feminism and our various concerns on a day-to-day basis. With that, I'd like to briefly introduce Professor Singh. Professor Singh is a professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at the Nehru University in Delhi. She's trained as an art historian at University of Baroda and at the Punjab University in Chandigarh. She's also been a research editor at Marg, which is one of India's leading art publications, and she has many publications to her credit. Professor Salima Hashmi is someone who's known to all across Pakistan. She's a former principal of the National College of Arts and an author of many art publications, including The Eye Still Seeks and Unveiling the Visible, which explores at the lives and works of female Pakistani artists. So with that, I'd like to now hand over to Professor Salima Hashmi to navigate the conversation.
Thank you, Razi. And I think that I would not do much navigation. I think because I'm absolutely dying to see what Kavita has in store for us. The last time I heard her speak on something close to what we're going to talk about today, I was absolutely fascinated by the lens she put on with which to view what we thought were fairly staid and predictable ways of describing a time. And therefore, to see her unravel, uncover, and explore things that, nuances that we did not know or did not notice ever before. So Kavita, please, we're absolutely dying to see what you have brought with you. Far away, but close to our hearts, from Delhi to Lahore.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and such an honor to be sharing, if not the stage, then the screen with you, Salima, so Razi and the Lahore Lit Fest. I'm so grateful to at least virtually be in your presence, even if I couldn't make it to your beautiful city again. When you extended this invitation and said that it would be a session where I would perhaps speak about Mughal paintings and Salima ji would speak about contemporary miniature painting from Pakistan, I started thinking about the way we distinguish these two, the art of the past and the art of the present. And when we think of Mughal painting from the 16th and the 17th and the 18th centuries, for all the exquisiteness of their execution, we tend to think of these artists as working to express their patron's vision rather than their own. And this, I think, marks the great distinction between the way we think about painters of historic times and the way we think about painters of today, because we imagine that the painters of the past were always working to a commission, and it is only the painters of today who get to express their own subjectivity. So I was wondering if this is really the case. Did the painters of an earlier time have no space to express what they felt and what they saw? And it seemed to me that despite the close supervision under which a lot of Mughal artists would have worked in the Karkhana, despite the many demands that were made upon them, they did find ways to bring their own observations and even, I dare to say, their own political critique of their times somehow into their works. And I thought I'd share a few works where I feel I see this with you. So I'm going to start sharing a PowerPoint. And the first painting that I'd like to show you is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It was pasted into the pages of an album called the Wantage album. It was made probably late in Akbar's reign or early in Jahangir's reign. And it is obviously a painting of a Christian theme because it is the Mughal transcreation of a European Catholic print by a printmaker called Jerome Wierix. And this print shows the martyrdom of Saint Cecilia, who was an early Christian martyr. Now, what makes this painting particularly interesting for us is the little inscription in the lower margin, which says that it is Amale Nini, or the work of Nini, making it part of that very small handful of Mughal paintings that has been inscribed to a female artist. We know the names of a few other women artists from the Mughal period. We know that there was someone called Sahifa Banu. There was someone called Ruqayya Banu. And they have also left behind paintings that are very, very skilled copies of either European prints or of Safavid paintings from Iran. And the fact that we don't have any works that are signed by women artists, which are part of the big projects that were commissioned by the Mughal emperors, like the Jahangirnama or the Akbarnama, suggests that these were not women who were professional artists working in the atelier, but rather that they undertook these copies of prints and Persian paintings as learning exercises. And so probably these were the works of women from royal families or from the nobility who were learning to paint as part of their cultural exercises. Now, interesting as their works would be, this one particularly speaks to me because of the theme and because of the way it's been handled. So this is telling us about a Christian saint, but not just any saint, but a female saint, a female martyr. Saint Cecilia was somebody who lived in about the 2nd century AD or the 3rd century AD. She belonged to a noble Roman family. She had faith in Christ, and yet she was forced to marry a man who believed in the pagan religion of the times. And according to medieval sources, even during her marriage, whenever she heard music playing, her heart would swell up and she would spontaneously start singing from her heart praises of God. And for this reason, she is the patron saint of musicians. But because she was Christian and she was from a noble family, this was not acceptable and she was condemned to death. She was ordered to be burnt at the stake, but when the fire was lit, the fire wouldn't touch her. So then the executioners took her away from the stake and they tried to cut her neck. But 3 times the axe touched her neck and it would not behead her. So she survived in that condition for 3 days, and then she very slowly bled to death. Now one can imagine the allure of this subject for a woman artist. Cecilia is a woman who is forced into an unwanted marriage. She is persecuted for her faith. She still has the courage to defy authority. And it seems that she's going to be protected against all ills by the force of her goodness. But eventually, after she is repeatedly assaulted, she succumbs. But even if Nini never actually knew about the entire story of the life of the saint, and even if she was just visually responding to this print that showed a woman suffering and dying, surely the fact that it was a female martyr must have evoked something within her. And I feel if we compare the way the print depicts Cecilia and the painting depicts Cecilia, we can see how in the print, the martyr's eyes have been made sightless with death. But Nini's Cecilia in the painting looks back at us. She's conscious of what has been done to her, and she's demanding that we witness it too. And Nini also lengthens Cecilia's neck, I feel, and she softens the axe marks on it. as though the artist herself wanted to ease the martyr's pain. And in this, the artist seems to be joining this sorority of women who surround Cecilia, who sponge her wounds, who try to comfort her. And their tender concern, I think, perhaps is even meant to evoke the kind of solidarities that women experienced within the zenana. The second painting that I thought I'd share with you is from the Padshah Nama. This is a very famous manuscript that tells the history of Shah Jahan's reign. And each exquisite painting in this manuscript seems to be designed to display the wealth and the pomp and the power of the court. And no doubt, supervisors in the painting workshop were watching the artists very closely as they labored, ensuring that they didn't waste any of their precious skills or their precious materials on any kind of message or detail that wasn't authorized. There is one painting intended for the Padshah Nama, which actually has an inscription in which the artist says that he labored over that painting for 2 years. And this is a claim that actually becomes credible when you see the kind of detail that goes into these paintings. So each painting is the product of a tremendous amount of labor and has a lot of wealth poured into it, which makes it a really deluxe product. But even in such conditions, I believe that artists found ways to slip their own commentary and to find ways to actually puncture the grandiose narratives that they were obliged to construct in their paintings. And this seems to be the case in a tiny detail in this depiction, which is of the siege of Kandahar, not the Kandahar in Afghanistan, but a place with the same name in the Deccan. So here is this magnificent painting by the artist Payag, and it's showing the moment when some mines are detonated at the walls of this fort, which will cause the fort to crumble and will lead to the Mughal victory. In the foreground of this painting, we see a very richly dressed general gesticulating towards the flames and the billows that have come from the detonation of the mines. This is going to destroy the fort's outer walls, and it will cause the defenders to capitulate. And we see how the Mughal soldiers in the trench close to the general are stolidly watching this explosion. But those in the middle ground actually seem to display a different kind of emotion as they look at the bloodied bodies of 3 of their fellow soldiers who have fallen on the battlefield. And near these 3 dead bodies, in strokes that are barely visible, you have the artist sketching corpses that have decomposed and become skeletons and yet seem to be gesturing and grimacing and flailing about in pain. This is not a naturalistic detail. The bodies of Mughal soldiers would not have been left to rot on the battlefield. So these have to be apparitions of the future that await these living men. And as the eye moves along this arc of the ghoulish bodies and goes down the hillocks toward the bottom of the page, the eye comes to rest upon a little oasis in the foreground. Here, there are herbs that grow beside a pool, and on its shore are 2 little rabbits. One turns to the tumult at the fort, but the other is facing us. And it seems to be flecked with golden light as it contemplates its own reflection in the still water. What is this rabbit seeing? And what is this rabbit asking us to see? In these rabbits, in the stillness of this quiet corner, is the artist not asking us to reflect on the hollowness of power in the face of the fragility of our lives? I feel it's through small, silent insertions like this that the Mughal artist managed to fulfill and to exceed and then to even defy the purposes that they were expected to serve for the propagandist art that they were commissioned to make. Now, by the time of Jahangir and Shah Jahan, Mughal painting had become really sophisticated and refined. And one shouldn't be too surprised that artists of that time were able to find very subtle ways of making comments like this. But I find that these kinds of commentaries can be found with little insertions like this even in relatively early Mughal painting, like this battle scene, which is from one of the illustrated versions of the Akbarnama. This is a double page that is showing a victory that Akbar unexpectedly scores over what was considered an impregnable fortress in Chittor. The fortress was on a high hill, and the Mughal armies had made their own temporary mud fortifications on the hills that was neighboring. And one day, when Akbar, whom you see on the lower right here, was on a lookout point that was held by the Mughal army, from a distance, he noticed somebody walking about on the ramparts of the Chittor fort, and he saw that this man was being treated with a lot of deference by everyone around him. And Akbar realized by that this must be an important man. So he raised his gun and he fired a shot, and lo and behold, it hit home. Akbar had managed to kill the general who was in charge of the defense of Chittor. And with that death, the entire fort surrendered. But Akbar's artists, when they depict this moment, are not just celebrating Akbar's marksmanship or Akbar's observational skills. They are also investing their energies into thinking about the sagging body of the dying general, the frenzied grief of the women from his family who are cradling him in their laps. And on the facing page, you see a slightly later moment of time when the hero has died and his wives are burning themselves on his funeral pyre in an act of sati. And again, to me, the details that are filled in these tiny little, barely visible figures in the background, the gestures and expressions of grief, the wanton loss of innocent lives, the self-sacrifice that is born of love and loyalty versus the killings that express enmity and hatred, they seem to me to be profound comments that the painter has ventured to add to his interpretation of the event. In fact, if we see these kinds of observations coming up in relatively early Akbari painting, I feel that these kinds of messages can actually be seen in some of the earliest. We know about the fabulous Hamza Nama, which was possibly the first major project that Akbar's atelier attempted. The paintings were produced over a period of 10 or 15 years. And a leaf like this one actually comes at a stage possibly towards the end of the project, when Mughal painting has developed its own very supple and very confident language. And already here, at this early stage, I can see the way the artist takes us away from only celebrating the actions of the heroes and the daredevils to let us think for a moment about the fate of all of the ordinary ones who suffer in the shadows of great men, what we would call collateral damage in today's terms. So this is a thrilling moment from the Hamza Nama, which shows spies who are allied to Hamza sneaking into a city and killing the guards in the watchtower. And it's an absolutely brilliant page. The observation of the architecture, the way the rope sways with the weight of the body, every individual who's shown, the leaf on every tree. But what really grips me in this painting is the artist's observation of the creatures of the forest outside the city walls. As the men who are engaged in a struggle for power fight and kill each other, you have at the base of the tree a monkey mother consoling her terrified baby. And you wonder, what insincere words of comfort is she uttering, saying, don't be afraid, nothing will happen, I'm here for you, even as the blood drips off the walls and there are assassins who have no known or comprehensible motive who are roaming nearby. And look at the birds in this tree. They are fluttering in the air. The commotion above them has disturbed them. They have left their perches on the tree. But one bird we see towards the bottom of this detail, one bird cannot leave. And why? Because she's standing guard near her nest. Whatever the perils of the night, she is held to this place by the ties that bind her to her unborn young. How can she afford to save herself and go away? It's details like these that make me think of the empathy that the Mughal artist had for ordinary people who just come in the way, you know, in the path of ambitious men. And actually, there's no painting that shows that better than this other painting from the Akbarnama that I've picked out for today, which shows us that the victims of violence sometimes are not just the people who are killed. This page comes from an early part of the Akbarnama. The text actually deals with all the generations that preceded Akbar, so all the way from Adam to Akbar's time. And this page comes from a section that is dealing with one of the Mughal ancestors, which is the famous conqueror Genghis Khan. And when Genghis Khan died, he had commanded his people that he didn't want his grave to be disturbed. He didn't want it to be robbed for all the gold and other offerings that would be kept in it. And so he had said that his burial place had to be kept a secret. And accordingly, as his army marched with his coffin, which you see over here, they had to kill each and every bystander that they encountered in order to keep the route that they were taking a secret. Now, in this version, we're seeing Akbar's artist Manohar imagining this event from the distant past on the ground of his current reality. So the kind of landscape, the kind of trees, the kind of animals like the elephant, the human beings, their ethnicities, their costumes, their weapons, they all reflect the heterogeneity of a contemporary Mughal military force. But the detail that really gets me is at the bottom left, where a soldier has set upon a hapless, blameless bystander and has to put him to death. And the terror that we see on the face of the doomed man, it's understandable. But what is it that accounts for the trauma that is etched on the executioner's face? I think the artist has imagined here what it does to be ordered to kill people for no fault of their own. And he has understood and he has conveyed the psychic toll that it takes on the man who wields the sword, not just the one who is its victim. And I really shiver at the acuteness of the artist's vision in this. Finally, I'm going to end by showing one really famous painting from Jahangir's period. This is a painting that is considered one of the dream paintings of Jahangir, a very famous set of paintings that are supposed to visualize for us in allegorical terms some of the dreams or mystical visions that Jahangir had. And these have been called paintings that show an extreme psychophancy on the part of the Mughal painter, because they show very overblown images of Jahangir consorting with great and good people that he never met, receiving tribute from people he never subjugated, or defeating people whom his military could never conquer. So these are called sometimes the psychophantic creations of a courtly artist who is trying to soothe the insecurities of an anxious, aging, and quite opium-addled monarch. So to find a hidden meaning in such paintings, which are intended to flatter, would be unusual indeed. The majority of the dream paintings are actually made by Jahangir's favorite artist, Abul Hasan, who was not just a particularly favored artist, but had been a faithful follower of Jahangir's, and possibly had been inducted into the Deen-e-Ilahi, which means that he would have accepted Jahangir as his spiritual mentor, not just as his earthly ruler. And so perhaps it's wishful on my part to imagine that there is some kind of a dissenting note in this painting that belongs to the series that so thoroughly aggrandizes Jahangir, but I see it nonetheless. This is supposed to be an allegorical painting of Jahangir killing the demon of poverty. And the inscription on it says that this is the auspicious portrait of His Majesty, who with the arrow of generosity eradicated the traces of dalidra, that comes from a Sanskrit word for poverty, daridra. So eradicated the traces of dalidra from the world and laid anew the foundation of a world marked by justice and munificence. It resembles in its composition another allegorical painting in which Jahangir is shown shooting arrows into the beheaded head of a dreaded military enemy whom he never defeated and who in fact outlived Jahangir. So the allegorical imagery in this painting is a little bit complicated. Jahangir is standing on a globe that traces the continents and the oceans, but it also has a figure of a lion and a lamb sitting together, denoting universal peace in his reign. The globe lies upon a man who lies upon a fish, and this is a reference to some Hindu cosmological beliefs. But behind Jahangir is the chain of justice that he had hung outside his palace wall, where anyone could ring the bell to ask for justice. But in this painting, the chain of justice is extending all the way up to heaven. Above Jahangir's head, there are angels fluttering with a crown, showing us that his kingship is divinely endowed. And another angel has come down to earth and is offering Jahangir these bejeweled arrows to fit to his bow. Jahangir is poised, he's ready to shoot, and the arrow that he has already let loose has met its target. For on the left edge of the painting, you see cowering a figure that is clad in darkness. And this is Dalidar, the very personification of the poverty that Jahangir has shot. The emperor's arrow has pierced poverty's left eye. And the second arrow will no doubt put out his right eye, blinding poverty and thus completely incapacitating him. But if we look again at the figure that Jahangir has shot, it's an old, naked, emaciated, dark-skinned man. And with all of these qualities, he must emblematize the lowest, the most marginalized members of society. And surely a king's job is to lift up such people and not cut them down. Jahangir's own overfed frame then contrasts terribly with this figure of poverty. And as the poor old man cringes, but waits for the coming blow without protest, it becomes clear to me that Jahangir is not killing poverty. He's attacking a poor man. Would the artist in his own life, probably in class closer to the figure of poverty than to imperial riches, not had a sneaking suspicion of sympathy for this broken and poor man? I like to imagine that he would, and that his sympathy finds its way into this image, perhaps even in spite of himself. I'm going to stop here, Salima.
Wow, that was something. I mean, one is taken into a completely different realm, looking at these images, which, you know, you see through, well, you normally see through a very distanced way. You look at them, you know, as to look at, you marvel at them, you enjoy all the things that make a painting enjoyable. But I think you seldom look beyond what is there. And the way that you have kind of penetrated the possibilities makes one absolutely keen to go back to these works and to, you know, you can sort of say, okay, let's think about how now to look at all those works with which one has often been very familiar and look at them differently. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the invitation that comes across when one is listening to you. One is almost impatient to say, okay, so let's get back to, you know, what we're familiar with and see what we missed, because so much has been missed. And now when I'm going to talk about what's happening today or, you know, in the last decade or more in Pakistan, we are, as you said, you know, the artist today has the absolute luxury, if you can call it, of saying what they want to say, apparently. And though even now we have learned, because of our special circumstances, to be allegorical at times, to be oblique at times, to be careful in how one couches one's views, even as one enjoys the rigor that is part of the training, part of the education of the contemporary miniaturist. Of course, the story in Pakistan starts more or less with one institution and one set of people, and that is in NCA. To begin with, Haji Sharif, who came from the Patiala, Maharaja Patiala, they were court painters. But by the time partition was happening, court painters were no longer required. So the family kind of went on to almost to take up photography, which was also much in demand at the time. Until he was asked by the Punjab University to teach painting, miniature, which he did, and then he moved to NCA. And he was a teacher of people like Zahur al-Akhlaq and so on. And then when he became too old, you had the next Ustad, who was Sheikh Shujaullah, who came from Alwar. His family, actually part of his family still lives there, as we discovered when we took a trip to Alwar with students of NCA. We discovered, our Ustad's family is still living there. And then his student, who was Bashir, came to be known as Ustad Bashir today. So you had this kind of background with which the miniature studio started becoming an alternative to the general painting studio, which was available. And certain students gravitated towards it. And in the beginning, it was just copy work. It was learning the rigor, line after line after line, until, Zahur al-Akhlaq, once he came back from looking at the paintings in the V&A, the British Museum, decided really to open up, the whole sort of premise of why you should be teaching miniature painting to the contemporary artists today. There has to be, some kind of a logic to it. And it was then that he gently said to him, because he was a very non-confrontational person. So he didn't want to accost the teacher himself, Ustad Bashir himself. So he said to me, why don't you suggest to Bashir that the students should do things other than copying? So it was left to confrontational me, though I'm not. I gently suggested that they could, do other things, which they slowly began to. There were skirmishes, to do with how you're not going to degrade a hallowed tradition and all the rest of it. But really, let's look at the first image, which is of the first student who really broke the boundaries, as it were. And she went on to do wonderful things. And that was Shazia Sikandar, now internationally very well known. And her first sort of, I would say, adventure was in her thesis painting when she did a 5-foot-long Vasili, the surface. So it was the scale that she was experimenting with and telling the story of an upper middle class family. But this work, which is later, was when she had gone to the US, study at RISD, and then try to look back at what her teaching had been, what her teachers had done, and how she was going to alter the ways of working. And one of the first things she did was to really attack the simple surface and make it layered in different ways. And of course, the content. It was very much to do with being a female. You find a kind of a cow-type image there with a veil over the head. And that was a reference in one point to when Shazia went around the campus with a burqa on and sort of traumatized the campus, who of course had never seen anything like this. And, this was before 9/11. But she enjoyed it because she said, I suddenly saw what an advantage it was to be able to see everybody and nobody can see me, and sort of turning the gaze around, if you like. So with that, I think there was a kind of breakthrough, because before that, she'd been rather dejected about how to make a space in what was a very contemporary teaching studio. And then, so you have here in which she is looking at the traditional, beautiful maiden and erasing, certain aspects and introducing other things in there, which then became a kind of a hallmark for her. And she went on, as we know, to do tremendous work, in which the the paintings jumped off the vasli and went onto walls, and they went into, many, many layers, etc., and then later into digital world. But I think it's useful to remember these turning points in the work of the contemporary miniaturists and how they then challenged the genre itself and really drew out what they found were important aspects of what they wanted to do. So I would say, the work is titled something else, but I like to think in my mind of it, it's a portrait of a young woman as an artist. Going back to what you were talking about earlier in the painting of Saint Cecilia, that does come a point where the young woman artist asserts herself in what has been quite a masculine, arena. And the next one, if I could look at, back home, Shazia was making waves elsewhere. Back home, you had the next generation of young women artists who were struggling to find an indigenous imagery which would somehow reflect their own personal struggles and their adventures in what the lusciousness of the medium offered. So together with the rigor, you had with the idea of trying to find some aspects of what they found in the tradition, but also make it answerable to their own life's experience. And with this works with Ayesha, which is called Pattern to Follow, it arose out of, I think, what were her breakthrough moments in which she was referring to the death or the suicide of a close relative, a young woman who was said to be barren and therefore became a subject of gossip and so on and so forth. So the fruit on the table is really a symbol of the fertility, the fecundity of the female. And then you have the burqa-clad woman in the foreground and looking into this interior space, with seemingly a celebratory atmosphere, the red roses, the colorful pattern. But if you look very carefully at it, you sense there's a kind of foreboding because there is that parda, there is the curtain, and you examine the curtain and there are these watchful eyes, very delicately drawn on the folds of the curtain. And the oppressiveness of the room, which earlier you thought was a delightful pattern, now, the walls seem to be closing in. And it is no longer just a celebration of pattern, which we do all the time in the subcontinent, but it is pattern which through its constant repetition becomes oppressive, the walls become suffocating, and the domestic space becomes a prison. Even though it's, marked by these wonderful red roses, which you can say are to celebrate the female. She has a back to us. We have these wonderful patterns, on her garment. And yet this conversation between the interior and the exterior, there is this desire to escape, which is very, very carefully enunciated. I think Ayesha Khalid was the first person here who really worked and struggled to find a very personal vocabulary, which was directly related to her being a female artist. And look at the next one, and we're looking at Imran Qureshi, who by the time he painted this work, and the time that Ayesha had done the previous work, they were man and wife. And in this work, you have, which is his Missile series, but it's one of the earlier ones. So by 2000, there was a change in Pakistan. 1999, Musharraf took over, the next military dictatorship. You'd had respite from 1988 to 1999. Just a few years of 2 or 3 civilian governments, Benazir, Sharif, back and forth. And it was Musharraf's time really marked the rise of the Taliban. And suddenly, You find Pakistan is in the eye of a storm. But you look at this work and you feel there's a kind of celebration with the red and the garment, the garland around it. But then behind there is the rocket, the missile. The one significant thing that Imran Qureshi has introduced is the element of collage. The Vasli now is no longer that pristine Vasli. There is something added to it, which is about the here and now, the printed page. Is it a newspaper? Is it something from a manuscript, which is read very definitely? And in between, there is that reference to a Kangra landscape, which at this time he had fallen in love with Kangra painting, and the leaves come directly out of that, and there is delicate tendril which comes out and then became a kind of a significant element which he uses and reuses. And in a way, it debates the harshness of the arms and the gentleness of something that is well remembered and is very romantic. And of course, I have to say that, yes, Imran and Ayesha had got married, and there were these two young artists whose work was totally different from one another. And yet you find these references to that. So if we can have the next one, which is also part of his missile series. I think by now, it seemed that Pakistan was going to have to battle with conflict within, apart from what was happening in Afghanistan. And definitely, even though, as he said, I tried to make the missile human, make it more gentle by the introduction of these bushes that he has. And very cutely, he used to call them the love bush, these which you find in Kangra landscapes, which he anoints the harshness of the missile and makes it gentler and makes it, less effective. Because as he said, that I cannot imagine, and that's an artist speaking, and I refer now to some of the works that you have shown, because he said, I cannot imagine that these missiles can ever do any harm, So he was really projecting his own hopes on the purpose of these things to begin with. And you really say that, the appearance of the Kangra landscape and the delicate tendrils, they refer to the artist's personal life, but they're also a desire to negate conflict, to speak of the possibilities of peace. And we know that, Imran was one of the young teachers by this time at NCA who took the effort to bring students, miniature painters across the border to help them discover what was the other side. So in a way, they were running a parallel narrative to the harshness of the state narratives on both sides. And in fact, there's in this case include Afghanistan also. So here the artist takes on the role not just of a commentator and observer, but also somebody who's attempting to be the negotiator, attempting to be the moderator, attempting somehow to put conflicts to rest. And in that way, one realizes that it is very often the artist who will be the voice of sanity and the voice of peace. Can you have the next one, please? No, we've missed one. We've missed Bamiyan. Khadim Ali, not very long after this, 2003, came the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. And for someone, because he was an artist, Hazara artist, the family had moved from Afghanistan, from the Hazara Jat, to live in Quetta, and they were deeply connected to what was going on in their historic, their historic roots. And therefore, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddha led to a series of works. And he is looking at these overlappings and these layerings in which underneath you see the Vesuvius man. You look at, the history of the artists looking at what was the finest that art could offer in terms of science, in terms of looking at the human body, the idealization of the human body. The Buddha and the emptiness created by the destruction of the Buddha is layered on top of the Vesuvius man. And then you see these punctuations, which are these dark marks, which are bullets or grenades. And up there is the lotus from the Buddhist times, but its center is now the grenade. So there is this conversation going on between the historical tradition, which were to do with peace, which were to do with contemplation and meditation, the great Buddhist legacies, which were devastated. And there's a kind of a sadness there, because until the destruction of the Bamyan, and there's something Khadim shared with me. He said, until the destruction of the Bamyan Buddhas, the world did not sit up and take notice of what the Taliban was doing. It was only when world heritage was destroyed did they suddenly become the villains, if you like. And there was great bitterness, and sadness with which he did these series, because it was loss of, he took it personally. It was loss of his heritage, the loss of the heritage of people who, very much were part of this whole region. Because don't forget, Kandahar within Pakistan is a very major part of historical tradition. So you have, I think, artists who during this time have looked at canons, which were in other cultures also, like you have, the introduction of that gentle Leonardo image, and then look at what is destroying that, as well as, more contemporary takes on what is happening in the world. So this business of the artists reporting on conflict, which you have talked about, in your selection of images, and to find that that is an issue very alive and relevant to what artists are talking about today in the same tradition. It hasn't gone away. The subject has not gone away. The subject is very, very much there. And therefore, one wonders whether these things are there all the time in the artist's mind. It doesn't matter what the particular period it is. It doesn't matter who the patron is, or if there's an absence of patron. It is a very tangible, very important part of the artist's desire to be witness to their time. And I'm just going to show you the last image, which I can't let go without introducing the humor, the dark humor, which has been so much part of the Pakistani contemporary miniature. And I think it is there because so many things you've not been able to talk about directly. So Saira Wasim is one of those artists with a naughty sense of humor, but also a strong desire to comment in a very overt manner. There is, there's not much subtlety there in what the topic of this painting is. She's not trying to hide it from her erstwhile patron. She's coming right up there because, this is very soon after 9/11, when the choice was, Pervez Musharraf, the dictator, having to decide, is he going to side with the powers that be, the US of A, or is he going to strike another kind of a pathway? It was not possible. And therefore, there they are. He's riding the lion. And you have this carousel with people going round and round and round. It is, I think, to my mind, a reference to the fact that the army taking over in Pakistan is not a rare event, that, the carousel goes round and round and round. And then, and the sidelines, and it's so interesting because I was looking at this, day before yesterday, and I think it's so funny because in the background, you have these little figures who are our political leaders, and they're looking, as spectators, watching at what the real action is. And you have some people who are very familiar today. You have, some who passed on, like Qazi Hussain Ahmad and Chaudhry Nasrullah, but you have Imran Khan very much there. You have Tahir al-Qadri. I mean, you have people who the Pakistani audience will recognize. Certainly, you will recognize our current PM. And this was 2003. So it's really before the rise, if you like, of particular leaders and the fall of particular leaders. And there is this, this thing being carried, which you can interpret in multiple ways, whether it's a casket, whether it's a funeral procession, whatever it is, but it's very luscious looking. It's decorative, as we know that the coffin under Pakistani, a Muslim is never decorated like this. So there's a kind of hints and layers to what this is about in that sense. But, and she did a series of works which were called Friendship After 9/11. And she's, taking the mickey out of public figures, but they're being done with such, I would say, a playfulness that you cannot really take exception to what is being done. You're sort of saying, okay, so that is life. We know that these are the things that, these are the goings on, if you like, in the political arena. You sort of see, she's introduced little things like there's the truck, the painted truck. There are these cherubs flying all over the place. It's not meant to be an image of any kind of conflict. It is about almost like these toy soldiers who are going off, and there's a kind of a sham war, if you like, which is, so there are many nuanced sort of references here, which you can, and the aura of the man who's riding the lion. At what point the lion decides to, have another guy go at whoever's there is a different matter. But I think that the richness of the palette, the deliciousness of the profiling, all of these things make a work which makes it sort of politically benign, even as the message is quite stringent. So the artist is playing the game which the artists have played since time immemorial, and which you have also hinted at, that they know how to walk the tightrope. They know how to say just the right things in a way that they will prod the audience to think, but will not offend to the point where it could possibly be dangerous for them, but they will have their say. And I think that possibly the artists having their say in whatever way they can is something that comes through all these years in which you have talked about the artist's role in a very, very well-defined role in the court, 4,000 painters working away, in Akbar's time, and the fact that you had a very preordained path, and you could not in any way step outside that role, where today you have the possibility of stepping outside that role, but the issues are still dangers for the artists. And so they play with these possible ways of negotiating for their own safety. They learn to do that. And I think as they do it, they also bear witness to that time. And they don't overlook what is going around them. They fulfill that role. And that to me is, after all, why we have artists maybe. They delight us, they give us solace. And the last image that I'd like to show you is something very recent. It's by a young artist called Yasser Waqas. And it's a work that we put on at the Fez Festival in 2018. And it's called A Song for This Day, which is a reference to Fez's poem, Aaj Ke Naam, or Aaj Ke Gham Ke Naam. And it is, this image of this figure taking off. The figure is barely visible. It's somehow lost in the dark blue, but the wings are visible, and they're actual wings. They're taxidermied wings, against the lusciousness of the gold leaf. So, so people used to, and a lot of people stood in front of these and had their photographs taken. So you had so many people standing there, and it seemed that the wings were coming out from their figures. And it was about the oppressiveness that we feel in our societies today, but the fact that you are allowed to dream of something in which perhaps you can break out, break free, and soar into however high you can soar. I think we should give to the artist a great deal, pay them tribute for the fact that they make us, give us the ability to think beyond our time and to live beyond that time. And therefore, artists are quite useful, don't you think? So I think that we should end there from my side.